Thank you. I had no clue people were interested, and here you all are. So I was telling Bobby about my employment agreement with Glendale Road is every 5 years I get a 1-month sabbatical. And part of that is so that the church knows that they can get by without me, and I know I can get by without them. Because one day that's probably going to happen. I won't be here any longer. But 5 years ago is when I started the research on my book in earnest. And so, a lot of people go, where did you go? Did you go to Great? I was in my kitchen. That's where I went every day. Got that laptop and worked it out. And so that's how the book came. And mainly I tell people I wrote the book mainly for the sake of my children so that our tradition, our history isn't lost. And I just gave a copy to one of my wife's co-workers, and she is also an author, and she was telling me, here's what you need to do when you do book signings. And I said, that's a lot to do. I said, I am the worst self-promoter. I said, I only cared that my children had this history, but now other people have it too, so that's kind of good. I'm really flattered by that. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second, but I did want to speak more relevant to us here in the Jackson Purchase area. Now, last year in July, there were 2 Graves County men who were arrested for desecrating an Indian burial site out in Fulton, Kentucky. And they have worked with the Fulton County Sheriff's Office as well as the Chickasaw Nation in order to rectify that issue. Now, the prevailing narrative of the Jackson Purchase has been this was the Chickasaw hunting ground, right? That's pretty much what we all say, what we all know. Well, the fact that there's a burial ground made me question whether or not this was just hunting ground. And yes, it was, but my thinking is, and Bill Mulligan and I had this conversation, this is such a huge swath of land to just be left empty. And so there has to have been some native people that probably dwelt around here. And so I started digging right into that. And I told Bobby, I said, I've gone down the rabbit hole. And in about 3 weeks, I've got 3.5 sheets of paper typed out of things that I found. So first thing I wanted to do, I wanted to look at early sources on Western Kentucky. And I started with Christopher Gist, his diary in 1751. The only thing he mentions about the Chickasaw is that they were along the Mississippian River, but they were not a part of the Iroquois Confederacy. I said, okay, that's fine. And then I got onto the Draper manuscripts. Those are dated between 1770 to 1780. There are a few mentions of the Chickasaw in the Draper manuscripts, but nothing relevant to what I was looking for. But now I got to the first Kentucky historian, John Filson. In 1784, he wrote, the Chickasaws inhabit. Now, if you go back and read it, that's when they had F's in the places of S's. So I'm not going to say the Chickasaws, it sounds like I have a lisp. The Chickasaws inhabit about 100 miles northwest from our settlement at French Lick on Cumberland River on the heads of the river called Tumbeki, which runs into Mobile Bay. Do y'all know where he's talking about French Lick on the Cumberland? It's Nashville. 100 miles northwest of Nashville, land between the lakes, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So in 1784, he's mentioning that Chickasaws, about 100 miles northwest of Nashville, he said they inhabit right up in that area. And it kind of makes sense too, because if you think about the attack on Fort Jefferson, which is Clarksville, the Chickasaws assaulted that fort because the people were building there and were trying to occupy some of their land. Now, it is true that mainly in Memphis, Tennessee, on into Mississippi, that's the main stomping ground of the Chickasaw. But they're also known to have hunted in West Tennessee up into Western Kentucky. And from what John Filson says, they went about as far as, Fort Campbell to land between the lakes. And now I've spoken with the historian of the Chickasaw Nation, and I've shared these quotations with him. And he said of John Filson, he said, he's wrong. He should have said southwest, 160 miles. And I go, your point is well taken. However, I'm pretty sure people in the 18th century that knew north, east, west, south, I'm pretty sure they knew what they knew. If I tell my wife today, she works at the Anna Mae Owen Hospice House, honey, when you pull out of the parking lot, go east. She'll go, wait a second. She'll go, Lewis and Clark. Do I go toward town or away from town? Right? But in those days, people were pretty good navigators. And so there was a pamphlet that was written detailing an earthquake in 1811, and it mentions how aboard a flatboat near Fulton, Kentucky, the party was, quote, apprehensive of danger from the Indians, which suggests there was a presence somewhere over there near the Mississippi. Now, if they weren't living around here, why would it have been written that they were apprehensive of the danger of Indians? Now, I'll grant it could have been that they were there at a time that a hunting party was moving through. That's possible. But you look at some of these and you go, well, it's clear that the Chickasaw passed through here, that they hunted through here, but they would have harassed anybody that tried to set up shop here. And so these folks in 1811 that were on this flatboat, the fact that they knew of a presence probably suggests that there might have been little bands that had dwelt here. For example, the Chickasaw Nation and the Choctaws used to be one people. But those two brothers, after whom the tribes are named, they had a disagreement. And so Chickasaw went one way, Choctaw went the other way, and depending on who you followed, you were now of that nation. And so, believe it or not, Native peoples didn't always get along even with our own people. We got to think sometimes there might have been a little splinter among a group, and a group may have said, hey, we're just going to go over this way. But yet they still have that shared history. They still have that shared language. One historian is quoted as having written in 1916, quote, and afforded access for the Chickasaws and Choctaws to West Tennessee, which was known as the common hunting ground for the Indians who lived in Kentucky on the north and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws on the south. Okay, so this guy, he acknowledges the Chickasaws and the Choctaws, but he also acknowledged some Indians to the north. Now, we know the Shawnee had a presence around here as well, so if he didn't know they were Chickasaw, then he just said Indians. Or it could have been that those were some of the Shawnee that were roaming around this area as well. But the acknowledgement of the Indians who lived in Kentucky, even though it's not altogether clear, it definitely is pointing to this is not just a hunting ground. People actually lived in this area. Now, here's what I found as I kept going down the rabbit hole. A TVA government study from 1993 concluded that the region ceased to be occupied by 1700. Well, if you trust the government, you can go with that. But I will say, when I read the report, they stated that, but there was no justification of that belief or a citation as to where they got that. Now, I will say the late Murray State professor and archaeologist Kit Wessler, in his book, claims, quote, no historical evidence exists that ancestral Chickasaw lived in Kentucky, end quote. So I'm taking all the information I can get, not just what supports what I want to believe. And I've actually contacted Professor at Murray State because the late Dr. Wessler did some archaeological digs here in the area, Hematite Lake and one out in Fulton. And I said, I would just like to read those reports. And he said, I'll get them and pass them along, just so you know there's no mention of Chickasaw in them. I'm like, that's okay. I still want to look at them because I might see something that I think is relevant that he might not be aware of. And that's another thing. A lot of times historians, we go through documented evidence, which is sometimes all that you have. But I think what you also have to look at too, if there is any, is archaeological evidence. As a preacher, one of the things that I love in having discussions about the Bible is, you all may know this. You remember David and Bathsheba, and you remember Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite. Now, for probably since the Enlightenment era into the early 1900s, skeptics of the Bible said the Bible's wrong. There's never been any evidence of Hittites. Well, and what do archaeologists do? They dig, and guess what? They found an entire library of Hittite artifacts with their writing on cylinders and all this other stuff. So I like to look at archaeology to see if it can complement what we have documented. So I will say that the government study, their main concern wasn't with who lived here when. That was a sentence, a part of a larger study for TVA's purposes. But a more recent claim, and this comes from Native America, a state-by-state historical encyclopedia, volume 1. So I think this is 3 volumes. And it says that there were towns along the Ohio and Tennessee rivers in Tennessee and Kentucky that Chickasaws occupied. And so I go, am I going to believe the government and their one-sentence claim, or am I going to believe in this peer-reviewed academic encyclopedia that does have an actual interest in that history? Even though it suits my purposes, I'm going with the encyclopedia. Just putting that out there. I'm going to be honest about my bias, at least. There was another source that stated that a small portion of Chickasaws lived in western Kentucky before the purchase. Now, I'm going to share this with Bobby when I get back to my office, and she is definitely welcome to share it with everyone here. I have my footnotes. Some of them are links. You can go look at what I looked at, okay? So, okay, I got to thinking about this burial ground, and I'm like, well, what were the hunting and the burial customs of the Chickasaw? The hunting customs was, like most tribes, a lot of times you would have a party that would set out and they would go a pretty good distance in order to get game. Because if you think about it, they're mainly located in Memphis, down into Mississippi, almost to central Mississippi. The place where you regularly occupy, if you're there a lot, that disrupts the pattern of the animals. So you do want to go to a less congested area to hunt. And the Jackson Purchase is a pretty good area for that. So I think it can be both. It can be a hunting ground, but it also could have been a habitation for some bands, even though we don't have the mounds like what we do further south. And so what I read is, a Chickasaw hunting party would go and they'd set up camp. They would take medicine administered by a holy man. What that medicine is, who knows? They could have been tripping on mushrooms for all we know. They would do this for 4 days, and then they usually hunted deer. They carried a charm with them, which was usually a deer's tail, a root, and a medicine pouch. And there were plentiful beavers, but they would not hunt beavers because that was an animal that was beneath them to kill. Kind of interesting. I didn't know that part until I read about it. So they would use every part of an animal, and it was only after the encounter with Europeans, when pelts became a currency, that natives began hunting for the sake of numbers rather than for the sake of just feeding your family. And so they would use every bit, and I didn't know this, but I found it interesting. When you tan a hide, there's enough of something in the brain of the animal that you can use to tan it with. I forget what that was called, but I saw this show called Mountain Men on National Geographic, and one of those old timers explained that. And so that's one of those useless information things that I stuck in my pocket, Miss Pat. Now, there were other times that they would hunt bears as well, and usually that would take a whole party, but they would do this while they were hibernating. So they would find where they were hibernating, they would sneak in, and if for some reason they disturbed the animal, they would lie prone and just wait for the animal to pass, and then they would attack it. So I read. Now, the burial customs, there's not a lot that we know. We know, according to H.B. Cushman, who lived in the 1800s and lived among both the Choctaw and the Chickasaw on different occasions, he said they buried their dead soon after dying. A later account says that some Chickasaws were buried under their homes. Was, okay, where's Nana? That was interesting. Now, what I wanted to do before today, but I was unable to do because of Snowmageddon, I wanted to go to Fulton and find where this burial ground is, not to disrupt it, just to look at it, take pictures, and see if I can get an idea of the date of this burial ground. And so that's a next move for me. Also, I'm going to keep going down the rabbit hole and see what more information I can gather about the Chickasaw living here. But a lot of Chickasaw life is comparable to Choctaw life because we do share a language. It's called a Muskogean language. And Stuart Alexander, the president of the Rotary Club, he is working on erecting what's called a peace pole. And so he said, I want to have, may peace prevail on the earth is the phrase. He said, I want to have that in English. I want to have it in Spanish. I want to have it in Vietnamese. And then he suggested another language, and I said, well, Stuart, what if we did it in Chickasaw? And he was like, do you think you could work that out? I said, I'll do what I can. I could probably work it out better in Choctaw. It's almost like, it's like reading the King James versus the Message. I say the Choctaw is like the Message. We're like, hey, the Chickasaw are like, behold, or something like that. And so once, I got the official translation from the Choctaw Nation, I gave that to Stuart and I go, yeah, that very first word means earth or world. In Choctaw, we say Yachni. In Chickasaw, you go Yaakni. I'm like, they just have to be extra. I don't get it. So I did recognize that word. But so taking the two tribes together, if I share with you a little bit of Choctaw society and culture, it'll give you a little bit of a window into Chickasaw as well. Now, our tribes were matrilineal, which meant it mattered more who your mother was than who your father was. And so today, and I'm glad we're not matrilineal today because Hunter is my father's surname, which he got from his father, which he got, you see where I'm going. If I had taken my mother's surname, which is also Scottish, the way that it's spelled is Cleghorn. Yeah, you're working that out, aren't you? And in Tennessee, Cleghorn. But in Scotland, Cleghorn. That's my cue. No. Here you go. So yeah, in Scotland, I was like, oh, that is so much more palatable. Cleghorn, right? Cleghorn. So we're matrilineal. And so what happened is, ever since the time of the French, I don't think we got along with the Spanish very well. As a matter of fact, I know the Choctaw fought the Spanish. Y'all have heard of Tuscaloosa, Alabama? Okay, Tuscaloosa is how you say black warrior in Choctaw. And that was a chief of the Choctaw, and he fought Hernando de Soto. And to give you an idea of the matrilineal nature, oftentimes if the men and their wives would feed them feathers as they shot bows and arrows. And one of the Spanish chroniclers noted that when the men fell in battle, the women took up their arms and continued to fight because it's better to die in battle than to ever be made a slave. And so if those of you that have ever met my daughter, you will get what I mean by tough Choctaw women. She's presently at the police academy in Richmond, Kentucky. And we get to hear reports of all the idiots that she is in the academy with. So she doesn't suffer fools very well, but apparently she's surrounded by them. One of the more prominent surnames in Choctaw is LaFleur. So, okay, some Choctaw woman way back when married a French guy, and he had children. Well, because his father was European descent, you have the privileges of patriarchal nature. But because of who his mother was in the tribe, there's a good shot he's going to become a chief. So in tribal life, who your mother was everything. So if you would go, say, to a social, mom and the kids would go sit with her clan. Dad would go sit with his clan. If they ever decided to split up, husband would take what little belongings he had and he would go back to his clan. Mom kept the house and the children. And mom's elder brother, raised her children, not her father. That's because it was all matrilineal. You get your teachings from your mother's side. Don't forget, because your father, he's over there teaching his nephews and nieces. It was vastly different than what we understand today. And part of that may be why there seems to be a lot of dysfunction in those who grow up on reservations. There's this book, Naomi Schaefer Riley. I think it's entitled The Second Trail of Tears. And she notes in that book that Native Americans are highest in poverty, domestic abuse, alcoholism, gang activity, and those statistics are worse if you live on the reservation. The reason I bring that up is because a friend of mine recently asked me a few years ago, he said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, go ahead." He's like, "I don't want to offend you." I'm like, "Trust me, I don't have emotions to be offended. Just, what's the question?" He was like, "What are your thoughts about mascots?" This was around the time they're changing all the mascots and everything. And so I stated to him all these stats about living on the reservations. I said, "I really believe we got bigger problems than a mascot. If that's the biggest thing we got to face, that's pretty good." But when you consider my grandmother, she was born there in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Her first language was Choctaw. She was sent to boarding school in Oklahoma where she learned English. And she spoke pretty good English. You could converse with her. But now my great-grandfather, her father, he was around a lot. I was the eldest grandchild, and so I got to see everything firsthand. We called him Afo, A-F-O. I said, "Mima," not a very Indian grandmother name for an Indian grandmother. She was Mimo. "Mimo, why do we call Afo Afo?" She said, "That's how you say grandfather in Choctaw." Oh. And like her aunt Bessie, Pogani is how you say grandmother, but to say great aunt is Hogani. So you go, Hogani Pogani, great aunt. And it's, yeah, and of course, and it makes sense, but you know, when my cousins were little or someone would have children over and they would soil a diaper, Meemaw, and change that, and she'd go, "Wawashu." That's a way to say that smells in Choctaw. And I was like, "Oh, I thought it was just a sound you made." So you pick up a little bit of these things along the way, but there's a Choctaw elder. She's still alive. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee. Her name is Sally Wells. Sally is the first Native person to offer the invocation at the state capitol in an indigenous language. And she gave that invocation in Choctaw. I see her probably at least once a year when I go down for the powwow. Sally told me a few stories that were it gives me a little bit of an idea the time my grandmother grew up in. Sally, there are 6 or 7 communities in the reservation. Ours are Pearl River. That's where my people are from, the Pearl River community. You have Standing Pine, you have Tucker, Bog Homa, Konahara, Bog Chito. Bog Chito, that's how you say big stream, big river. Sally grew up in Bog Chito, and at the time she grew up, it's well documented that the Bog Chito community was the most leery of non-Choctaw people, white people especially. Sally told me that she and her sisters lived under the constant threat of the men knocking on the door and saying, "We're going to take your children." Why would they do that, Sally? Because you're supposed to be in school, and we didn't have a school on the reservation. So Sally was taken, she and her sisters, West Tennessee, and they lived with a family during the week. And if they could see their parents on the weekends, they would. Those children only knew how to speak Choctaw. They didn't know English. And so she grew up going to school, living with her sisters in a stranger's house, close enough to school that they could walk back and forth each day. Well, as she got older, one of her brothers, as you mentioned, sharecropping, one of her brothers was a sharecropper, and he had a very idyllic piece of land. And Sally told me there was a white man that wanted to acquire his land, and he just wouldn't sell it to him. So one day her brother went out to work, and everybody did their own stuff. And she said they didn't see him for 2 days, and then they kind of headed out to where he might be. And she said there were buzzards flying overhead. She said they had killed him, and he lay dead there in that field. Another story she told me is she and her mother had to go to the courthouse on the town square. And there was a restroom there that was on the exterior, similar to ours. And they came out, and not long after coming out, there's this scream from the women's restroom. And this woman runs out and is pointing at her mother saying, "She took my purse, she took my purse." And so Sally and her mother knew just to stand still. They get the sheriff out there. The sheriff searches her. Where is the purse? Don't know where the purse is. One of the deputies goes into the restroom, and he comes out with the purse. She had set it on the radiator, and it fell behind. But she just assumed that the Choctaw lady took it. There's also, when I was doing this research, I noticed Afo, of course, he divorced his first wife, my grandmother. And when he married his second wife, on the marriage certificate, it's marked colored. I was like, huh. In 1927, there was a case between an Asian man and a white man. And the Mississippi Supreme Court determined that if you are not white, you are to mark colored in the state of Mississippi. And I'm like, well, that's why he marked colored. And I've got a picture in some of my files. I think it's in that book too, of these Choctaw women sitting on a bench with their children. And in between them, you can see on the bench a sign, coloreds only. And I'm sitting there going, wow. So that kind of gives me a little, you're talking Jim Crow, Mississippi. Anybody ever seen Mississippi Burning with Gene Hackman? Where did they find those guys? On Choctaw land. Go back and rewatch that movie, because you remember there's that one guy, he's sitting there chopping up a fish with a little shack behind him, and he shows those agents where that car is. And I mean, that's right there on the reservation. So that was probably the earliest cinema depiction of Choctaw, is in Mississippi Burning. And, I talked to my grandmother about it, and she was like, yeah, a lot of them live in the marsh, because when the Trail of Tears happened, the Choctaw were the first to go in 1831. The treaty was signed September 27th, 1830. The reason I can remember that date is because I met my wife September 27th, 1999. So I don't tell her that, but that's how that's not the best association, but it helps me remember. And so in 31 they go, but many of them refuse to go. They run to the woods, they run to the marshes, they hide out. And, it's not until 1945 that the Mississippi Band of Choctaw is formally recognized by the United States government. All the Choctaws in Oklahoma, they are called the Choctaw Nation. We all used to be called that. But the Choctaw Nation's in Oklahoma, Mississippi Band is in Mississippi. The Jenna Band is in Louisiana, because our ancestral land used to be central to southern Mississippi, Louisiana, over into Alabama. So that's a pretty huge swath of land. But we were considerably larger than the Chickasaw. I think estimates around the signing of the Jackson Purchase was that there were 2,000 Chickasaw. There were probably about 30,000 Choctaw. So we were, considerably larger than that tribe. But
did you say they were the Choctaw and Chickasaw were the same?
Yes, they used to be one nation many centuries ago, and then the disagreement with the brothers, they became their own nations. So Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, we all use a Muskogean language, and that's how they were able to communicate amongst themselves. So I tell you all that not to go feel sorry for the natives. As a matter of fact, don't, because natives are very proud people. Don't want pity. History is what it is. Y'all didn't do it, okay? So you shouldn't feel guilty about it. But what I'll also say is, if y'all hadn't come along, we'd have still been fighting amongst ourselves, okay? So the prevailing narrative is the white man did the natives bad. Well, that's true, but before the white man came and did us bad, we were doing each other bad. My fifth great-grandfather, Mushalatubby, received his name as a war chief when he would lead raids against the Osage. So we were doing it to each other. Y'all just happened to have more sophisticated weaponry, but it is what it is. I like the history because, for me, it's a story of resilience. Everything that my grandmother lived through, that her parents, all the way back, I'm like, I've had it easy. I've been very blessed. I've not had to deal with a lot of that stuff. I think the worst I've ever had to deal with is a person looking at me and going, "What are you?" It doesn't offend me, but I do like to have fun with it. So this one white lady, she was at church, she was visiting. She's like, now what are you? I said, what do you mean? I knew what she meant. She's like, well, it's clear that you're white, but you're not all the way white. You could have just said I was a stain. I said, well, what do you think I am? I said, I'll give you 3 guesses. What do you think? Mexican. That's the most common. I go, no? Okay. Filipino. I was like, no, I'm a little taller. They're small people. And I was like, no. I'm like, no. She's like, give me a hint. I'm like, no, this is fun. And her last guess was Japanese. I was like, huh, oh, Japanese, But it was funny to me, and I said, no, I'm Choctaw. She said, what is that? I said, that's a Native American tribe in the Southeast. And she's like, oh, and lost interest. Any questions? I'll entertain questions. Yes, sir.
There's a national wildlife preserve down up in Lauderdale County, Tennessee. I think it's called the Chickasaw National Wildlife Preserve. And it's also a little town up there. Several years ago, it was mainly Native American people. Just a small little town.
So that's a little band of Choctaws. So in the 1950s, I was sharing this earlier, in the 1950s, right after the war, you got farmers over there who I guess had lost a lot as far as, sons and so forth. And so somehow a Choctaw man heard about it. I don't know if it's an advertisement or what, but they would go up and work during the seasons and go back. Well, then before too long, you've got several families going, and rather than just working through the seasons, they set up shop there. Yeah, it's, what is it, Fort Lauderdale County? Is that right? Yeah. Okay, yeah, Henning, Tennessee is what I know. But yeah, so that little group of Choctaw, that's the only federally recognized natives in the state of Tennessee. But that was, so I was talking to Randy Patterson, the chief that was in charge when I was growing up, his name is Philip Martin. And after Philip passed away or quit running for the chief, Phyllis, I forget her last name, but the first female chief, and she was the one that annexed that. And now it is recognized as tribal property. Yeah.
What are the mounds at Wickliffe?
They are a Mississippian culture, and that's Mississippian. It ends in 1500, but I think it goes back as far as 800 AD. And that's what Chickasaw, Choctaw, and all of those. Specifically what tribe, we don't know. But it could have been a sister to Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek. Because there is in Mississippi, there's our mother mound. It's called Nunawaya, and that translates to leaning hill. Nunawaya, now, depending on which version, the historical version is the one you believe. The mythological version is the one you go, that's cool. The mythological version is out of the ground. From this spot, the Choctaw people rose, and as a monument, they built this mound to honor the Creator. That's the mythological tale. The historical tale is a great people migrated from the west, and this is our history too. A holy man would set a sacred pole every night called Fabasa, and every morning, whichever way the pole leaned, that's the direction they would travel. Well, when they got to Nunawaya, they set the pole. The next morning, the pole stood straight up, and they said, we have reached our new homeland. And so that's a protected site, and there's a marker right there at it, and you can actually walk up on the mound and take pictures. But the placard there says that it could go back as far as to the time of Christ. So that's how old that is. But yeah, the Wickliffe mounds are dated, I believe, from 1100 to 1350.
It's been years since I was down there.
Yeah, so useless information. She was not lying when she read that. I've got a lot of it. Oh, okay.
But there's some more mounds too between Henderson, Tennessee, and Jackson.
Yes.
Now,
Now, I noticed in the early 80s, the farthest southeastern corner of Kentucky, there was And I don't know if the Mississippi was lower then or not, but there was an archaeological exploration down there because there were mounds. And that's the thing, you know, because as time changes, the what do you call it, the environment changes, topography and so forth. Like, if I had one of those nice little scuba mobiles that goes under the water, I'd want to go all through Land Between the Lakes and just see what I could see. Because I'm sure there's got to be something native somewhere down there. But I don't have, if y'all have a scuba thing, let me know and I'll rent it from you and I'll go look. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this kind of reinforces what you've said. I had a friend that I'm not going to name because he used to collect relics and artifacts of Native people along the lake shore. And he said he could go down and walk the edge of Kentucky Lake, especially in the winter when the water was low, and find artifacts. And then the other thing that kind of reinforces what you said about established people who lived here, Duhat and I, our grandmother's farm, every time they plowed the garden, they dug up not just arrowheads, but utensils and things that would indicate that there were people who stayed there over an extended period of time. And it's close to, was it the Night Branch?
Close to a good source of water.
It's close to a good source of water.
Which is typically where they would live, was pretty close to a major body of water. One of the interesting things, and every so often I like, you need to share this. I was talking about the matrilineal nature of the tribe. The word for woman in Choctaw is ohoyo. The word for love is hulo. The word for heart is hulitupa. All the cognates of the root of the word that gives us woman, heart, love, sacred, precious. That's pretty interesting within a language, that the root of the word is what gives us woman. It's like I'm on life support. I'm just going to hold it, but I thought you would find that interesting. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Trail of Tears and that some refused to go. I wondered if you've ever heard of any connection between those that stayed behind and the Melungeons.
Ooh, that's interesting. I have not, but that's very interesting.
Yeah, the Melungeons, they're most commonly found in the Appalachians. And it was, what I've read is blacks and native tribal people who did not want to be forced off of the land or be subjected to Jim Crow treatment, called themselves Melungeons, and they have very specific physical characteristics. Many times they're dark complected with dark hair and blue eyes. So it's worth looking it up.
That is interesting. So my grandmother, when I've got a picture of her, and my aunt told me this, she would avoid the sun. When she was younger, there's a picture of her, and I understood why. If I were to show you at a quick glance, you would think that's a black woman, because she would be that. Her natural skin tone was dark, but then if she spent time in the sun, you know, she would be real dark, and I wonder if she wasn't treated a certain kind of way if she was mistaken for having been a black woman at that time. But I will say this, you know, for full transparency, Choctaws also owned slaves. Mushalatubby, my fifth great-grandfather, he owned about 10 to 12, which was modest compared to some of the other chiefs. I also know that he had multiple wives. Now, if you go out to the Choctaw Nation and you ever meet someone with the surname King, that's a descendant of Mushalatubby. But now I'm thinking that maybe some of his children or some of his wives and their children stayed behind. But because there are records indicating that, you know, he doted over one wife more so than the other. And I'm like, hey, we'll leave that there. How I ended up here? Well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I won't go that far back. So I came here, it'll be 10 years this June, to work with the Glendale Road Church of Christ. probably 16 years ago, I was hired at the New Concord Church of Christ and was there for about 2.5 years. And so we left there and we were in Central Kentucky for a couple years. We were in Bowling Green for a couple years. And there's a whole bunch of events that happened. You look back and you go, I see God's providence in this. At the time, you're going, what is happening? But Glendale, of course, I did not follow John Dale. Someone else, Jason Hart, followed John Dale. And I was at New Concord at the time. And I remember telling one of the older members that I love dearly, I said, I don't think Jesus could follow John Dale. He is so loved. But I said, I've got best wishes for Jason. And Jason was here about 5 or 6 years, and the position became opened. And a friend of mine who had ministered in New Providence, he was like, Stephen, you should really go for it. He was like, I would, but we're here. I'm happy. I'm like, okay. And so I did and prayed, and here we are. And if you've never met me before now, you've missed out on a lot. But if you've known me ever since then, I don't know what you say in your prayers. I just hope it's good. Does that help? Yes, sir.
I was thinking along, is there any evidence as to when the Choctaw became more sedentary versus having seasonal camps? Because many native groups would move seasonally where the fishing was, where the hunting was, and they would often leave crops planted in one place and then return to them.
Yeah.
And that, because it may well be it's a semantic issue. There are very few white people, Europeans here. And so the Indian, if the native presence was seasonal, it may have escaped notice because it wasn't what Europeans thought of as a settlement.
Yeah.
It wasn't permanent. I mean, we know that they discounted native religions because they didn't have churches.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure when that would be. I would think, if I had to just guess, it was probably not long after having encountered Europeans. Because one of the things that the Choctaw, I know we did, is if we looked at these people and like, hey, they've got this figured out, well, we're going to do that too. Whatever that is. I know corn has always been a part of Choctaw life. There's actually a mythical corn story where this lady appears to two men on the top of Nanawaya, and she says, y'all are new here, you don't have anything, but here's the gift of corn. Because there used to be around July what's called the Green Corn Festival, is what it is in English. And it was like a big celebration among the Choctaw of the gift of corn. But yeah, that's I don't know the answer to that, but that's kind of interesting. Now you have me wondering. I'm already down one rabbit hole. Now I've got the Melungeons and I've got so. Well, okay, thank you. Thanks for having me, everybody. I appreciate it. There you go.